Okay, well, this is our video for the next part of the reading of our Babylonian Captivity and thinking about the sacraments. And the pages we're going to try to read are pages 52, it starts there in that first full paragraph, through 59. And 59 ends, it's really obvious where it ends because it says the sacrament of baptism. So here's the good news, it's 7 pages, pretty manageable, and we'll call it because, it's just a lot going on right now, and this is a really good resource, and maybe we'll enjoy it so much that later on we'll come back and read through the other ones. So you got an indefinite amount of time to read pages 52 through 59, and also if you got hung up on the other ones, now you have time to go back. And really, they're all pretty short readings. There's just the second one that's a bit long, but now you have as much time as you need. So what we're going to start with is just, if you're only going to read one paragraph, and if you're only going to read one paragraph of the thing, of our assignment, that's the last one on page 54. And I'm just going to read it here. So Luther says, just as distributing a testament or accepting a promise differs diametrically from offering a sacrifice, so it is a contradiction in terms to call the Mass a sacrifice. For the former is something we receive, and the latter is something that we give. The same thing cannot be received and offered at the same time, nor can it be both given and accepted by the same person, any more than our prayers can be the same thing as that which our prayers obtains, or the act of praying be the same thing as the act of receiving that for which we pray. So, hearing it, hopefully you turned and followed along, and you can just spend a lot of time getting at it. But really, he said it a few different ways here, but the first sentence, just as distributing a testament or a will, just as distributing what the will said so-and-so gets, that's not the same thing as being the one who receives it. And so Luther's saying that's the problem with thinking about the church service as a sacrifice, as something we do, because that's not what's happening. What's happening is God is giving something, and really specifically when he's talking about the Mass, he means communion. When people said the Mass, everyone knew it meant communion, and one of our notes talks about that. That's what Luther means, okay? So now at this point you may be thinking, Luther's been harping on that the whole point, this whole time. Well, that's right, because this is the only issue for him. And it's so hard to appreciate how significant what he's going back to was. Like, we kind of think like, of course grace was a thing and people talked about it, and maybe, Luther's just emphasizing it a little more, but it's not that. It's much more dramatic than that. In fact, talking about this, just me, and is really hard to get at. So, but here's the next thing that kind of gives you a bit of a taste for how significant what he's talking about is. And it's the beginning of that first longish paragraph, and I'm not going to read the whole thing on page 52. But he says, so he starts off saying, but you're going to say, what is this? You're going to overturn the practices and teaching of all the churches and monasteries by virtue of which they have flourished for all these centuries. So, and he says, the Mass is the foundation of their anniversaries, their intercessions, their applications, communications, etc. That is to say, their fat income. And so Luther's talking about the practice of thinking of communion as something that we did to kind of put a marble on our good deed scale, that this idea had infiltrated the whole church, and in so many ways, and they were just quite significant. In fact, at the end of that paragraph, I want to read the last few sentences. He says, I am uttering unheard of and startling things, but if you will consider what the Mass is, you will realize that I have spoken the truth. The fault lies with our false sense of security, which blinds us. to the wrath of God that is raging against us. And by Luther, what he means by the wrath of God is that God's just let us kind of chase down our own devices and think going to church was something that we were doing to make God happy, which we earned, and it was our right for salvation by going to this many services and having this many marbles on the good side of our scale, that when we came up to the pearly gates, we said, well, God, you owe us, so let us in. And Luther sees the wrath of God of just letting us run headlong toward this wrong thing. So here's the deal, though. Luther's talking specifically at his time, but this will be our question. We really quickly kind of lose sight of that. What being a Christian is being people who have been claimed and saved by Christ, and that's the only shape our life looks, and how quickly we think these gifts that God has given us become something that are ours and something that we use to show that, well, we're the right kind of Christians, or we're doing life right, or whatever it is. So I guess the question could be to think, where are some ways it'll be easier to talk about like church in general in ways where that little division where the emphasis on this is everything that God and Jesus Christ has done for us is lost, and all of a sudden it's become, well, this is our project, and we're doing this to show what good, right, virtuous sort of people we are. So this happens in a lot of ways. Once you start thinking about it, you'll be off to the races. But I guess that'll be the question. As I read this section, and it's not too long, I appreciated just how challenging it must be to read and how contextual it is. And like at the very beginning, I said all these things Martin Luther's assuming, on page 56, he that first full paragraph that starts when he says the same thing happens, and he's talking about the elevation of the host, of holding the communion wafer, communion bread up for everyone to see it, and he's talking about the practices of this time, and he does a little like well, it wouldn't be English, it'd be German, but a linguistic lesson of where he sees this coming from and how it functions. And at the time, the thought was, when you held it up, you're saying, here's what I'm offering to you, God, the body and blood of your Son, Jesus Christ. I've done this. I've participated in this service that turned the bread into wine, the bread into Jesus' body and the wine into his blood, and now we're offering it up to you as some sort of good thing we've done. So the whole practice of what's going on. On page 58, toward the end of it, he references that he's talking about the saying of Gregory and talking about practices. It's going back to a really early Christian heresy, Donatism. He talks about the alien work of God. These are all things with really rich histories, of which you are a part, but that we may or may not be familiar with. So I get it. It's a lot of work. So all I want to say is, we've noticed how Luther's just harping on this. And the thing is, we always need people harping on it, because we're so quick to turn this gift that we've received into something that we've achieved, something that we use to measure that we're doing it right, whatever it might be. And Luther's constantly calling us back, because as soon as it becomes about what we need to do or what we have done, well, Jesus is just there, a prop in the background of our life. And so here at the end, I just want to read it's the last paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he's talking about, let me bring it to an end. And so he concludes here, and he says, from all that's been said, we can conclude that the Mass was provided only for those. So he's talking about who's communion for? And he says it's only for those. And here's what he says. It's only for those who have a sad, afflicted, disturbed, perplexed, and erring conscience, and they alone commune worthily. That communion is only for, and the only people who would do it right are those who are sad, those who are afflicted, those who are disturbed or perplexed, those with an erring conscience. In other words, what makes you ready for communion and how you do it right is when things aren't going right in your life. And this is why it is such good news that Luther isn't going to let go, that he's going to keep repeating that it's about what God has given to us in a will and testament in Jesus Christ, by what Jesus Christ has done. So this whole thing got off to the races of thinking about virtual communion. I'd still love to hear how you think that may or may not play into all of this, because I don't know that I've come to any sort of satisfactory conclusions. But there at the end, you can see how it's just utter good news about what Luther's about. So we're just going to wrap it up here. I could say more. I wish I could talk with you in person about it. But hope it's nothing else. That last paragraph, it's words of comfort for your day. And then now we're just going to take a break and you have time to go back through those. And as you do, either in the group, our message group, send "I just read this, it's so great," or send me an email or text or call me or whatever. So, all right, well, I've enjoyed this. Thanks for indulging me. Bye.